Hi, welcome to another lesson in Family and Consumer Management. I'm your teacher for today, Carleen Spence Smart. The objectives for today's lesson are: what is pastry? We will be discussing the types of pastries. We will also be looking at the functions of the main ingredients used in short crust pastry and exploring characteristics of a good pastry. To start our lesson today, we will be playing a game. The game is called Drag and Drop. I'll just give you can read the instructions on the screen. Let us get into the game. Okay, so on screen you're seeing some words, and those are a list of different food products. Notice to the right, there is a basket. All you need to do is to select the word or the food that is a pastry or that you consider a pastry and drop it in the basket. If you drop a food item that is not a pastry in the basket, you will lose 1 point. Let us begin. So there we can see we have bun, beef patty, muffins, gizzards, Swiss roll, tarts. Which one of these do you consider to be pastry? Yes, beef patty is a pastry. I see your gizzard. You are correct. It is also a pastry. This student is very bright. Tarts. Yes, those are pastries. Wow, here we have bun. Is bun a pastry? What we will do at the end of the game, we're going to define pastry. And then you will know if you have lost a point or not. Okay, class. Based on the selections that you have made, what would you consider a pastry? Okay, let us go. A pastry is a dough made from flour, fat, and liquid. It is also used as a casing for foods. Now, let us go back and look at the items that you have selected. Do you see any of them being used as a casing for food? Great. So, notice you would have selected bun. Are you seeing why bun is not a pastry? Yes, correct. It is not being used as a casing. Great. What I'm going to do for you now, we're going to be looking at a video slide to show you different types of pastries. Now that you've seen the slides, let us identify common types of pastries. Short crust pastry, flaky pastry, puff pastry, hot water crust pastry, rough puff pastry, shoe pastry, and sweat. What make these pastries different? 1. The kind of fat. 2. The proportion of fat to flour and the method of mixing the fat with the flour. All these 3 determine the type of pastry. Let us explain the proportion for each type of pastry. Short crust. Short crust uses a proportion of half fat to flour. What do we mean? If we have 1 pound of flour, it means that we would need 8 ounces of fat. You may be wondering, fat? Yes. Fat may be margarine, butter, shortening, or lard. Flaky pastry. Flaky pastry uses a proportion of 3/4 fat to flour. What do we mean? If we are using 8 ounces of flour, we would need 6 ounces of fat. Puff pastry. Puff pastry uses an equal proportion of fat to flour. Can someone guess the proportion of fat to flour for puff pastry? You're correct. If you're using 1 pound of flour, yes, you would use 1 pound of fat. Give yourselves a round of applause. Great. Rough puff pastry. Rough puff pastry uses the same proportion of fat to flour as in flaky pastry. Do you remember the proportion of fat to flour for flaky pastry? You're correct. 3/4 fat to flour. That is 8 ounces of flour to 6 ounces of fat. Now, as you go down your hot water crust pastry, let me explain something before we touch the hot water crust. When we're making pastries, it is important that all ingredients are cold. Now notice we are looking on hot water crust. This is an exception, right? So this method, we use the mixing method. So we'd mix the ingredients together to form a paste. We have looked on short crust, flaky, puff, and rough puff. Those pastries, the proportion of fat and the kind of fat determines the types of pastries. For the hot water crust, the choux pastry, and the sweat, those would be under the method of mixing. So this means the method of mixing would determine the type of pastry. For today, we will be focusing on short crust pastry. as you can see, I have gone ahead to show you the calculation for the proportion of fat to flour when making short crust pastry. There, 1/2 to 1. Half fat to 1 flour. This means if we're using 1 pound of flour, we would use 1/2 pound of fat. Okay, I'm going to give you one to work out for yourselves. If you're making short crust pastry, I am going to give you 2 pounds of flour. What amount of fat would you need to make that dough? Yes? Yes? You are correct. You would need 1 pound of fat to make your dough. Great. So we're going to continue. We're moving on to characteristics of a good pastry. Let us look on the functions of the main ingredients used in making short crust pastry. We will start with the flour. The flour, what do you think is the main function of the flour? I heard somebody saying structural. Yes. Somebody said the shape. You're correct. The function of the flour, it helps to form the structure of your dough. It also helps in gluten development. And that is what will help to keep your dough together when it starts to bake. Yes. Let us look on the fat. The function of the fat used in making short crust pastry is mainly for, yes, flavor. Now you can use different types of fat when making short crust pastry. Each has their own advantages and disadvantages. Let us look on margarine. Margarine is considered the best fat to be used. Why? Margarine is hard. It takes a longer time to melt. And when the product is baked, it gives it a good color. Butter? Butter is also good. The disadvantage in using butter is that butter melts quickly. Shortening. Shortening is good for the shortness in the texture of your pastry, your short crust pastry. However, it does not contribute much to the color of your pastry. Usually when you use shortening alone, your pastry tends to be white. What we encourage, you can use a mixture of these fats. For example, you can mix your shortening and your margarine, half and half. You can mix your butter and your shortening, or your margarine and your butter. Water. Let us look on the function of the water when making short crust pastry. The water contributes to the steam. Once the product starts to bake, the water will produce steam in your dough, causing your pastry to rise. At this stage, I want you to make note. When making short crust pastry, the only raising agent added to your dough is air. You did not use any mechanical raising agent. So the water will help to trap or produce that steam. The water also helps to prevent the fat from melting in your dough. And finally, it contributes to the tenderness of your dough. Characteristics of short crust pastry. Based on the video presentation that you would have watched earlier, can you give me some characteristics of a good pastry? So let us look on it. 1, it produces a light golden brown color. So that's one characteristic. Pastries should have a light golden brown color. 2, lightness. Once your product has been baked, it is usually light. 3, shortness. Your short crust pastry, once broken, usually we would break a piece of the baked dough and then we would rub it between our fingers, and then you will be able to see the shortness. We will be looking on that later. Tenderness. This means that once you cut into it, it should not break up easily. You just cut, it keeps its shape, and it does not crumble. And finally, your short crust pastry should have an acceptable flavor. Now, if you use butter, you will taste the flavor of butter in your pastry. And depending on the ingredients, the other ingredients that you would have used in your product, you would also get the flavor from those ingredients. Let us review what we would have done for today's lesson. I'll be asking you some questions. We would have looked on the definition for pastry. Can someone share with me the definition for pastry? Yes, it is a dough made from flour, fat, and liquid. Correct. Could someone now tell me what makes each pastry different? I heard someone mention the kind of fat. That's correct. The proportion of fat. That's correct. And the method of mixing. If you had all those three, thumbs up. What are the different types of pastries? Short crust, yes. Flaky pastry, yes. Rough puff, that's correct. Choux, that's correct. Puff, that's correct. You're on your way to getting a good score on your test. Let us look on characteristics of pastry. Could you share with me some characteristics that you would have learned? Someone said an acceptable flavor. Correct. Light golden brown color. That is indeed correct. Lightness, tenderness. That's correct. One more bonus question before you go. Do you remember how to calculate the proportion of fat to flour? For short crust pastry, it is great, 1/2 to 1, which means 1 pound of flour to 1/2 pound of fat. That's correct. What would be the proportion for your flaky pastry? An example in ounces. 6 ounces of fat, yes, to 8 ounces of flour. You are correct. I hope that you would have learned something today. Please join me for the next class when we will be making a product using short crust pastry. Thanks for joining us today. Have a wonderful day.